Mark Worthing's fabulous book, Martin Luther, A Wild Boar in the Lord's Vineyard. I've enjoyed seeing Mark's work over recent years on a number of different ways, and so when he asked me if I would be part of this launch tonight, I was really keen to be able to do so. And I know that he was wanting some comments about the way in which Luther and all that his thought and subsequent actions played out in other denominations, not just, of course, in Lutheranism and the Catholic Church. But first of all, I want to say something about the book itself and what a fabulous publication it is. We know that there are many, many scholarly works about Martin Luther. We also know there are many very brief works about Martin Luther. But to have a work like this, which in 160 pages of text plus appendices covers the ground that it does, not only about Luther the person, but Luther, what you might say, the religious politician, but also the Reformation and the context, the geopolitical context in which he was living and working. To cover all that so well in this space is a major feat, and I congratulate Mark on just how well he has done that. Indeed, if I may make comparisons, I feel he is in the realm of writers like Thomas Cale with his book Desire of the Everlasting Hills and How the Irish Saved Civilization, both of which are quite brief works but cover such an immense wealth of information in their content. Now, I felt I knew something about the Reformation. I felt I knew something about Martin Luther. I had questions in my mind on a number of issues that I wondered, how could it be, for example, in the case of the Peasants' Revolt, that Martin Luther might on one stage have seemed to have encouraged and then seemed to have betrayed them. Or on other situations, how he could have been seen to have made comments that could have been seen to be very antagonistic and polarizing, especially later in his life. Now, Mark doesn't shy away from any of those sorts of issues. He goes right into them and proposes some ideas that are well worth considering, and particularly ideas that take account of the geopolitical or the religious geopolitical realities of the 16th century and how significant those issues were. And while we're talking about something that was 500 years ago, we need to understand that many of those issues, in a conceptual sense, live with us today and therefore offer us a great deal of thought as to what we might consider should be the case in these days. But let me make some comments about a number of these sorts of issues. First of all, Luther the man comes through in a very interesting way. I found myself at the end of each chapter wondering how this was going to play out in the next chapter. We see a very personal approach. Fortunately, Mark has been able to uncover a lot of information that colours in the reality of Martin Luther as a person. Obviously a frenetic worker, a very profound thinker, a prodigious writer, but also doing many other things. When he's first appointed to his as professor in Wittgenstein, he's doing many other things. In fact, I wondered if at the time whether or not he shouldn't have been called Martha Luther rather than Martin Luther, because he was so busy at so many things. But then we find in various ways the personality of the person comes through in the research that Mark has been able to do. There's reference to the table talk, the notes of conversations that had happened at the dining room table of the very hospitable Martin and Katie Luther, when so many people would come to their house. The table talk seems to be a kind of 16th century Twitter, where these little thoughts are all captured. But we also get to know a person who was profoundly deep in his thinking. He wanted to be able to understand God's purpose for him. He wanted to be able to understand what God wanted for his people, and he wanted to know how he should relate to that. And he did so at a time when there were particular political tensions happening, particularly between southern Western Europe and northern Western Europe. We find a connection with the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica becomes quite critical to this, the financing of that, and some of the very real budgetary problems that powers that be turn out to have had very religious implications. The need to raise, first of all Pope Julian and then Pope Leo, the need to raise extra money to help with the rebuilding of the Basilica, let alone to fund the military activities of some of those popes, led to a massive acceleration of the sale of indulgences, and indeed, if anything, if they had any justification whatsoever, and one finds that hard to imagine, they suddenly became a devalued currency by the way in which these plenary indulgences were being mass sold. And it's interesting to read that this actually did have an economic effect on the economies of the various German states, that they were seeing money siphoned off from their economies down south in Western Europe. So there was already a tension point happening there. Now Martin Luther, who had parents who wanted the best for him, they encouraged him to get an education. They hoped he would become a lawyer. That didn't turn out to be the case, because he found himself thinking about these deep religious issues, found himself waiting outside the back door of an Augustinian monastery, waiting to be permitted to come in there. And through the book we see just what kind of journey, what kind of pilgrimage of life Martin Luther was on in these ways, constantly wanting to understand better what God was expecting of him. And he almost has that Damascus moment, you might call it, or liken it to, when he discovers the power of that quote from Romans 1:17. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And that became, as I say, a kind of road to Damascus moment. He suddenly found himself understanding that what had been going on, not just for others in terms of the sale of indulgences and how bankrupt a proposition that was, he also found, speaking to himself, that it freed him of the burden that he was feeling, that he had to somehow meritoriously prove himself. Notwithstanding that, of course, he went on to a life of prodigious activity. What we find in the man also is a very human person, a person who suffered not only the slings and arrows of political fortune, he also suffered the tensions of a person who would have recurring bouts of depression. And I found it very moving, really, to see the honesty with which he dealt with that. And that great year of, he had a particularly great year, if that's the right phrase, the year of melancholy, 1527 to 1528, when he went into a very deep melancholia. And he was able to then, first of all, use that to speak to others who were going through similar situations, but then also for himself to actually understand how no one was free of these issues, and that didn't in any way affect his faith. It didn't affect the love of God. It didn't affect how God loved him. He could still be a person who would suffer these bouts of recurring depression. In terms of him as a politician, a religious politician, I found it particularly interesting to understand some of these issues better. I guess it had interested me what kind of role he had played in the Reformation. Clearly a pivotal role. Clearly a role that would gain great resonance in the 17 states of Germany. He had, if you might call him a patron, in Frederick the Wise. We might indeed call Frederick the incredibly forbearing, or Frederick the incredibly patient. It was, after all, on his castle that the young monk would go nailing things on the door, and that didn't set Frederick off against Luther. On the contrary, he would spend the rest of his life not only acting as an encourager and a patron, he also acted as a protector. But we find the situation that the tensions are happening between the papacy and between the German states and between the church in Germany. And there was an understanding that Luther had to be come to terms with. There were attempts to try and get him to compromise. And indeed, we see in Luther a political tactician. He was prepared at some stage to accept a kind of compromise agreement. But there were those who were his enemies, and you'll read about that in the book, who deliberately want to see that compromise broken apart. And so it does get broken apart, and finally Luther, of course, has to flee and seek protection. In the process, we have from 1517 all these issues of the papacy really taking him to task, happening in the early 1520s. Other situations are breaking out. There is deep tension throughout that part of Europe, leading, of course, to the Peasants' Revolt. And the Peasants' Revolt represented an upsurge of reaction, I guess, to the feudal contradictions of the world of the time, where increasingly the peasantry were finding themselves more and more oppressed. And in a sense, they were looking to Luther to be somebody who could help them. And this was one of the dilemmas I've had, because in what I'd read about him before, I would have thought so too. And yet, we see that Luther, at some point in that, is writing and actually encouraging the German princes to put down the insurrection. Now, Mark deals with this subject very frankly, but he actually very insightfully deals with it. He looks at the issue that, in fact, there was grave danger for the process of change. You could have change that would bring sustainable new directions, or you could have change that would simply burn down the house. And clearly, it appears Martin Luther was desperately worried that the house was about to be burnt down. Now, a more cynical view might be that, well, because the princes of the German states had also started to favour Luther, he would be in danger of alienating them if he sided with the peasants. But it does seem as if there was genuinely a belief that the things were going off the rails at this point, and that all could be lost if there was a total lack of moderation. Indeed, some of his letters, both to the princes and to the peasant leaders themselves, indicate that he is trying to keep things reined in to a manageable process. One wonders how he thought at the time that reacted to his own initial being a wild boar in God's vineyard, when he was going around nailing things to the door and generally enjoying provoking things. But I suspect that what he felt was that that was something he could contain and control, whereas later on this got to be well and truly out of control. One of the things that stood out to me in Mark Worthing's work about Martin Luther is that he would be well and truly prepared to argue his case, to stand up there and put his proposition. He would never shy away from putting his arguments. But he was actually able to play the argument, not the man, as the cliche goes. And he could be an amazing combatant in a very intensely logical and intense sense, but on the other hand, could also be gracious to those whom he was contending with. And in the chapter that talks about the remarkable hospitality of the newly married monk and nun, Martin Luther and Catherine, on their very wedding night, there is a knock on the door, and the knock on the door is none other than Karlstadt, whom he had a very tense discussion with some years before, never thought he would see again. Karlstadt had really stormed off. Karlstadt had actually called him out from the pub where he was with friends, as much as say, come on out here and let's talk this one out. Luther said, no, come on into the pub and we'll have a rational discussion. The rational discussion didn't satisfy Karlstadt and he wandered off. But here he was on the night of the wedding of Martin Luther and his wife, and Karlstadt is at the door begging for sanctuary, because in the wake of the aftermath of the peasants' rebellion, he's needing sanctuary. And so another very interesting aspect of the man. I find the issue of his theological studies was particularly helpful to me. I haven't had the opportunity to read even a fraction of Luther's voluminous output. And so Mark has put that together very helpfully to me. He certainly talks, of course, about the Romans 1:17 reference, but his description of the four alones, the four solas, the Scripture, Christ, grace, and faith, Scripture alone, Christ alone, grace alone, and faith alone, he very simply, succinctly describes how they became not only what you might call really alones, but integrated alones where each weaved in with the other. And what he meant by the alones there was that alone from the power plays of humankind, alone from the power plays of Christendom as such, rather than the Church of God. At the end, he had been an Augustinian monk. There had been tensions with the Dominicans, and Mark, in an appendix to the book, deals with that in a more informative way for those who want to pursue that issue even further. I know you have a discussion that's taking place tonight, and I don't want to take too much more time. Suffice to say, congratulations to Mark on the publication of this very worthy book, Mark Worthing. And it's also interesting to note that as we look at the impact of Luther upon Christianity, not just in Europe but around the world, as we look at how all denominations changed really as a result, the Catholic Church has changed over the centuries, impacted as much by what Luther was doing as by many of the other influences. And so I find it somewhat warmly, not ironic, that's not the right word, but in a kind of way it is the right word. But a warm feeling comes over me when I see that Pope Francis has called on Norway to help try and intercede with North Korea and the problems that are taking place there. The Catholic Pope calling on Lutheran Norway to be part of resolving a major geopolitical issue in our world today. So congratulations, Mark. This will be a very worthwhile publication to go out and add to information about Luther. I certainly learnt an enormous amount. So my apologies once again for not being there. Good night.